I want to begin today not with a headline, not with a market number, and not with a geopolitical event, but with a 26-page essay that almost no one read when it was published. The year was 1976. A retired British military officer named John Bagot Glubb, a man who had spent his career commanding armies in the deserts of Jordan and Iraq, a man who had witnessed firsthand the final exhale of the British Empire, sat down in his retirement and wrote what he called The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival. It was not a bestseller. It did not make headlines. It was published quietly in a small print run and largely ignored by the academic establishment. And yet, within those 26 pages, Glubb had identified something that no historian before him had stated so plainly, that across 3,000 years of recorded history, every major empire, regardless of its geography, its religion, its technology, or its form of governance, followed the same pattern of rise and structural decline, and every single one of them lasted approximately 250 years. Now, let me tell you why that number matters today more than it has ever mattered before. America declared its independence in 1776. In 2026, it turns 250 years old. I will not tell you this is destiny. I will not tell you this is inevitable. What I will tell you is this: the pattern is real. The data supports it. And anyone who takes history seriously owes themselves the discipline to look at it directly. Point 1. The 6 Ages. A map of every empire ever built. Glubb's framework is elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consistency. He identified 6 stages through which every great power passes, in sequence without exception. The first he called the Age of Pioneers, a phase in which a relatively obscure people, driven by energy, courage, and a fierce sense of collective purpose, burst onto the stage of history and overwhelmed the established order. These pioneers are not sophisticated. They are, in Glubb's own words, often poor, ill-clothed, and half-starved. But they possess something the dominant power has lost: the willingness to improvise, to risk everything, and to act. Think of the Macedonians before Alexander. Think of the Arabs before the rise of Islam. Think of the early American colonists who had nothing but conviction and refused to submit to the most powerful empire of their age. This age of pioneers gives way to the age of conquest, a period of rapid territorial and institutional expansion. Then comes the age of commerce, in which trade flourishes and material wealth begins to accumulate. The desire for glory transitions into the desire for prosperity, and the desire for prosperity begins, slowly, to transform the character of the civilization. Then the age of affluence, the high noon of empire. Great civic works, monumental architecture, extraordinary cultural production. Rome at its height. Britain at the moment of its greatest reach. America after 1945, rebuilding a shattered world in its own image, writing the rules of the international financial system at Bretton Woods, underwriting the security of entire continents. After affluence comes the age of intellect, a period of philosophical questioning, of the flowering of universities and academies, of complex theoretical discourse. And then finally, the stage that Glubb describes with the most clinical and dispassionate precision, the age of decadence. And here is where the pattern becomes uncomfortable, because the characteristics Glubb identified for the age of decadence, documented across the Assyrian, Persian, Arab, Roman, Spanish, and British empires, read with unsettling accuracy as a description of the present moment. Point 2, the arithmetic of structural decline, the numbers that don't lie. Now let me anchor this historical framework in the language that I trust most, because history can be contested, but arithmetic cannot. A recurring theme across every great power that Glubb examined was what scholars call overextension, the moment at which the cost of maintaining an empire begins to exceed the resources available to sustain it. Military commitments expand beyond what the treasury can support. The gap between what a power spends and what it earns widens steadily, then dramatically. And instead of confronting this arithmetic honestly, empire after empire chose to defer the reckoning through currency debasement, through borrowing, through the financial engineering of decline. Rome reduced the silver content of its coins. The Spanish crown borrowed against future shipments of American silver that were already committed to other creditors. The British Empire funded its final decades of global reach on borrowed capital. Today, the United States spends approximately $970 billion a year on interest payments alone, more than it spends on its entire national defense, while carrying a national debt that has now crossed $38 trillion. A recurring theme across every great power examined historically was precisely this: decline driven by the overextension of resources and military capabilities, combined with a declining focus on domestic investment. The same pattern appears in the Roman Empire, in the British Empire's exhausting struggle to maintain control in Southeast Asia amid nationalist movements and economic deterioration, and in the Mongol Empire's strategic overreach across multiple simultaneous fronts. Manufacturing as a share of the American economy has declined from 24% of GDP in 1970 to approximately 10% in 2025. The country imports roughly $800 billion more than it exports annually. And trust in government institutions has reached levels that, if measured in a foreign nation, Washington would cite as evidence of systemic instability. These are not political arguments. These are structural data points. And structural data points do not respond to speeches. Point 3. The age of decadence. What it actually looks like from the inside. Here is the most important and the most misunderstood feature of Glubb's framework. The citizens of a declining empire never recognize the pattern while they are living through it. This is not because they are unintelligent, it is because the symptoms of the age of decadence feel from the inside like normal life, or even like progress. Glubb identified the following characteristics as consistent markers of late-stage imperial decline, documented across every civilization he studied: an excessive reverence for celebrity over civic contribution, the prioritization of entertainment and spectacle over serious national purpose, the rise of what he called defensiveness, an unwillingness to take the risks that built the empire in the first place, the fragmentation of social cohesion into competing interest groups, each pursuing its own advantage at the expense of collective coherence, and perhaps most significantly, what Glubb described as a loss of the sense of duty, the replacement of what can I contribute with what can I receive. Now, I am not making a moral argument here. I am making a structural one, because Glubb's insight was not that decadence is a character flaw to be condemned. It is a structural phase to be recognized. And the reason it matters strategically is this: a civilization in the age of decadence loses the internal coherence required to respond effectively to external challenges. Not because of any single leader or any single policy failure, but because the cultural and institutional foundations that once made rapid adaptation possible have quietly eroded. The question is not whether a civilization is in decline. The question is, how aware is it of its own position in the cycle? Point 4. Game theory. What each actor is structurally forced to do. This is where the historical pattern meets contemporary strategic reality, and where the analysis becomes genuinely actionable rather than merely instructive. If we accept that historical patterns of great power transition are real, and the academic evidence now suggests strongly that they are, then we can apply game theory not to what leaders say they will do, but to what they are structurally forced to do. A power in the late stages of its hegemonic cycle faces a specific and well-documented set of incentive problems. Domestically, it must manage the competing demands of a population accustomed to affluence while its fiscal capacity is contracting. Internationally, it must maintain credibility as a guarantor of the global order it built, even as the cost of that guarantee is consuming resources at a rate it cannot sustain indefinitely. The response to these pressures, documented across the Roman, British, and Spanish cases, tends to follow a consistent pattern: increased reliance on financial leverage rather than productive investment, selective disengagement from multilateral commitments disguised as strategic prioritization, and a renewed emphasis on bilateral transactions, where the declining power can still extract short-term advantage from its residual asymmetric strengths. Meanwhile, the rising challenger faces a different but equally constrained set of incentives. It does not need to confront the dominant power directly. It needs only to build parallel systems, alternative trade routes, alternative financial infrastructure, alternative security arrangements, until the cost-benefit calculus of remaining inside the existing order shifts unfavorably for enough participants simultaneously. The quantitative modeling of historical great power trajectories suggests that the most likely critical inflection point for American hegemonic power falls somewhere around the middle of this century. Not a sudden rupture, but a crossing of thresholds, one by one, until the structural weight of the accumulated transitions becomes undeniable. Point 5. The crucial question: is America the exception or the rule? Every generation that has lived through a great power transition has asked this question. Every generation has been, to some degree, unable to answer it with full clarity while living inside it. The Romans did not believe Rome would end. The British, even as they were surrendering India and withdrawing from Suez, spoke confidently about Britain's enduring global role. And yet here is what the historical record actually tells us. The empires that managed their transitions most successfully were not the ones that denied the pattern. They were the ones that recognized it early enough to adapt, to preserve the institutional and cultural foundations that had genuine enduring value while releasing the structures that were consuming resources without producing proportionate strategic return. America possesses assets that no previous declining power possessed at a comparable stage. The world's most developed capital markets, an unmatched network of treaty alliances, technological leadership in artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing, and a demographic resilience rooted in continued immigration that most rival powers cannot match. These are real. They are not trivial. But as one analytical framework for assessing great power trajectories observes, power declines to a pattern. And what does not matter at all, according to this framework, is the specific nature of political institutions or ideological commitments. Every empire has believed its particular arrangement was exceptional, and yet the arithmetic has consistently proven indifferent to that belief. So I leave you today not with a verdict, but with a discipline. The discipline of looking at patterns honestly, of reading the structural data without the distortion of either optimism or pessimism, and of understanding that the most consequential decisions for individuals, for institutions, and for nations are made not in the moment of obvious crisis, but in the years before the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The historian Arnold Toynbee observed that civilizations do not fall by murder. They fall by suicide, as by the accumulated weight of choices that prioritize short-term advantage over long-term structural integrity. Whether America writes a different ending to this pattern is genuinely an open question, but the precondition for writing a different ending is the willingness to read the pattern clearly. And that willingness, that intellectual honesty in the face of uncomfortable arithmetic, is precisely what I believe this moment demands, because the arithmetic has always been patient, and it has never, in 3,000 years of recorded history, negotiated.